Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders to inspire us to think differently and lead better. For this episode, I'm thrilled to have Dr. Wendy Wood, who is the Provost Professor of Psychology and Business at the University of Southern California. She is widely considered one of the world's foremost authorities on habit formation and change. And she's also published over 100 articles and is the author of the best-selling book, Good Habits, Bad Habits. In this episode, we'll explore the science of habit formation, unpack the roles of context, friction, and rewards, and uncover why nearly half of what we do each day happens without our conscious thought. So whether you're striving for personal growth or trying to overcome those bad habits, or just curious about the psychology behind lasting change, you're in the right place. So get ready for actionable insights, practical tips, and eye-opening ideas that will help you take control of your habits and ultimately your life. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Well, let's start with something that you mentioned before, that many of us don't really understand what's driving our behavior. Can you explain what you mean by that and why it's so important to recognize?
Yeah, well, we only have access to our conscious thoughts and our feelings and desires, our emotions, and we think that that's all there is. But there's actually a large non-conscious part of our brain that works in ways that we don't recognize, that we don't have access to. And part of that is the habit portion of our brain. So habits drive our behavior, and we're not always aware that it's the habit that's responsible for what we're doing. And so that's why, we can introspect about so many things and make sense out of our memories and our feelings, but we can't introspect about our habits. They're just not accessible. We don't know if they're strong. We don't know if they're weak. We can't tell when they're working.
Well, and this disconnect is really critical because it means we often focus on changing behavior through motivation or effort, overlooking the powerful influence of our surroundings and our subconscious habits. Building on that, why are habits so fundamentally different than one-off decisions that rely on willpower and conscious thought?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that willpower is useful for making changes that are one-offs, deciding to join a retirement plan or deciding specifically what kind of new coffee to buy if you're in a new coffee shop. Those are decisions that we can make that require some executive control, is what we call it. But habits build up over time. So habits build through repetition. We have a part of our memory system that picks up what we do in a specific context that gets us some reward. And by reward, I mean just that it works for you in some way. So the way you typically make coffee in the morning, assuming you're a typical coffee drinker, the way you do that is out of habit because you've done it so many times. You don't have to wonder, what am I going to do? What kind of what kinds of coffee should I use? How should I make it? Do I even want coffee this morning? We don't need to ask ourselves those questions. Instead, because we've repeated the behavior so often in the past, and we're in that context, standing in front of our coffee maker first thing in the morning, the response that we've practiced just automatically comes to mind. So that's the difference between making a decision, which can involve willpower, and acting on habit. Habit just automatically is triggered by the context you're in. When we have a behavior in mind, we usually just act on it. That's called, psychologists call this ideomotor action. That's from William James.
So while willpower might get you started, habits persist because, like you mentioned, they're ingrained in our procedural memory. So they're operating in the background automatically, triggered by these consistent cues in the environment. So while our episodic memory is more prone to forgetting and not being that reliable, our procedural memory, like riding a bike, even if we haven't ridden it for 5 years, we're still able to do that regardless of the time frame. I mean, we might be a little rusty, but we can still ride a bike. Same way with our habits, right? They're more stable over time because they are recorded in a different part of our memory.
Exactly. They build up slowly over time and they only decay slowly over time. And in fact, some people think it is like riding a bike. You never lose a habit once you have it. And from a broader evolutionary sense, or even from a functional sense, this is very reasonable because what you're doing is you're capturing regularities in the environment and your behavior, and they don't change. So it's as if you're taking the most important information, what's most consistent in your life that's been working for you, and it's stored in a way that you don't have access to it and you can't change it. So it's very different from our beliefs and our feelings, which we can change. But habits are stored in a protective way that maintains them over time, even if we make decisions to change.
And that's why they're so difficult to change. I get this question a lot from leaders saying, how much of our daily lives is actually dictated by our habits? And it's run the gamut. And I love for you to kind of provide your research as far as saying daily actions, what percentage of those are habitual?
That was actually one of the first questions we started with when way back when we started this research program. And because, as I said, people can't introspect about their habits, we couldn't really ask people how much of your behavior is habitual. Most of us don't know. We don't think about it that way. So what we did is we used a technique of pinging people once an hour. We did this for several days. We asked people, what are you thinking about right now? What are you doing? And how often have you done this in this context in the past? And what we found is that about 40% of the time, people are repeating behaviors that they do almost every day in a particular context, and they're thinking about something other than what they're doing when they're engaged in the behavior. And that was really surprising because it suggests that a large proportion of our day runs off with us just sort of responding to familiar environmental cues and not actually thinking and making decisions about what we're doing.
And I've seen research where nearly half of our daily actions are habitual. These behaviors include brushing your teeth, commuting, even how we interact with colleagues. And what's surprising is, like what you stated, is most of us are unaware of the extent our habits dictate our behaviors because they operate outside of our conscious awareness. And this lack of awareness often leads to us underestimating the importance of habits in achieving the goals in our life, correct?
The thing is that because habits build up over time as we repeat behavior, most of our habits are what we would do anyway if we were thinking about it. So if you all of a sudden become aware that you are acting habitually, we can explain it very easily. So, so it most of the time it makes sense to us because it meets our current goals. It's the bad habits, it's the habits that don't meet our current goals that we're most aware of. And those are the ones, when I ask people, those are the ones that people report, oh, yeah, that's a habit. Let me give you an example of how unaware we are of our habits. And that has to do with typing. Most of us are really pretty good at typing on a keyboard, right? We think of a word, we read a word, we can type it without having to think much about what we're doing. So we're responding habitually, and we're responding very quickly. But if I ask you to list the keys on the second row of your keyboard, you probably would have more trouble doing that. And that just shows the disconnect between what we know about our behavior and the habits that actually drive our behavior. It's surprising how much of life we actually aren't paying attention to. But that's great because we get to ruminate about something that happened in the past, make sense out of it. We get to plan our day. It's all very functional, just that it's not the way we think we work.
Absolutely. Well, before we go deeper, provide us with a clear, simple definition of what a habit is and what sets it apart from other types of behaviors.
I define habits as, well, and I and the field defines habits as associations that you learn between a context and a response, so that all you have to do is be in that context again, and the response automatically comes to mind. So habits are mental associations. We learn them through experience. We learn them through repetition. I think of them as sort of mental shortcuts, right? They keep us from having to make decisions. They keep us typing quickly without having to search for where the keys are on the keyboard. That's what habits are.
And they could be triggered by environmental cues, but they're not conscious decisions and they're performed with little to no thought. Unlike deliberate actions, habits are efficient. They free up mental energy and resources for other tasks. And that's why evolutionary, they're so valuable to us. But there's certain biases that get in the way as well. And you mentioned one that I love for you to kind of unpack for our listeners, and that's the introspection illusion, where we feel like that we believe our actions are driven by our conscious thoughts and intentions, even when they're actually influenced by our non-conscious habits and environmental cues.
Yeah, Asaf Mazar and I have done some research on this. And we've actually had people form habits in the lab through repeating behavior. And then we have them respond, thinking they're making a decision, and they respond out of habit. And we ask them, so why did you make that response? And very few people say, it's because I practiced this task over and over again so that it became automatic and habitual. Instead, they make up reasons for it because I wanted to, because I just felt like it right now. It's very funny how we justify our behavior by assuming that we have access to it. And that's a kind of an illusion. And it serves us well. You know, it's not a bad thing to be convinced that you're in control of your behavior. That is functional as well. But it's also useful to recognize, if you're trying to change behavior, the limits of that control and exactly what does drive our habits. And it's not our decisions.
Well, and this illusion also makes us overestimate the role of willpower and rationality, leading us to these ineffective strategies for behavior change that so many are well versed in. But by acknowledging this bias, right, we can shift that focus to creating environments and systems that better support our desired habits, which is really where the focus should be.
If you know much about habits, you start getting a real respect for the environments that we live in because they present us with the choices that we make initially, and they make it easy or difficult, rewarding or not, to repeat a particular behavior. So the environments around us are really important in determining what habits we form and how difficult they are to break.
Well, let's move to the Stanford marshmallow experiment. It's a famous example of self-control because we're looking at kind of that self-control and willpower to be the driver of our behavior, which it's not. And you highlighted something unique in that study, which everyone I think knows this study, but you called it situational control. And how does this differ from self-control? And why is this often more effective at resisting temptations? And perhaps provide a little background on the study and kind of that piece of the study that not many people talk about.
It's a wonderfully inventive piece of research that most people with 4-year-olds know about because it was done in a nursery school with little kids who were given a marshmallow. And they were told that if they could sit and not eat the marshmallow for about 15 minutes, then they'd get 2 marshmallows. So it's a study in self-control, essentially. And as you can imagine, most 4-year-olds struggled a lot with that task. And if you have a 4-year-old, it's fun to try it on them, see if they can do it. And there's a lot of videos on the web of little kids trying to do this. But there's a condition in the study that didn't get much attention, but I think tells us an awful lot about self-control. And that is, in one condition, the kids were given a marshmallow, but the experimenter put a pie plate on top of it. So the kids couldn't see it. And then all of a sudden, over half of the children could wait for 2 marshmallows simply because they were not tempted in the same way. The situation had changed, and they were no longer being exposed to the cues to eat the marshmallow. They could lift up the plate anytime they wanted to, and they were told that they could. But just having that cover was enough to help the majority of kids delay and get 2 marshmallows. And that tells us a huge amount about how we can control our behavior without actively struggling or exerting effort and willpower. And that is by controlling the environment, by making it more difficult, even slightly more difficult. A pie plate is not hard to lift up, right? All of the kids could do that. But just having that small amount of friction, environmental friction, was enough to stop the majority of kids from eating the first marshmallow.
I
And
love that insight.
I love that part of the study because it's confusing that so few researchers have picked up on that. I mean, that was reported by Michelle, that this is the Walter Michel experiment. That was reported by Michelle early on, but not recognized. I don't think they recognized its importance until recently.
Well, and you're right. Situational control involves modifying the environment to reduce temptation, such as hiding the marshmallow from view, rather than relying on sheer willpower. This is so much more effective because willpower is a limited resource, whereas situational control removes the need to exert self-control entirely. And, for example, keeping unhealthy snacks out of the house eliminates the temptation to eat them, making it easier to maintain these healthy habits. And it's so critical in driving behavior because although those that were able to use willpower to resist that temptation, they did a longitudinal study of this experiment, right? They were more successful in the end. And they contrasted that, right, with that group that said, okay, let's just hide it from view. Now, it didn't turn out that they were more successful over their lifetimes, but it gives everyone else hope. Those that can't resist the marshmallow, right? Hope that we can exert that same type of discipline to make sure that our environment's modified if we can't resist the temptation by sheer willpower alone.
You're absolutely right. That's a great explanation of it. And the reason why all parents got so interested for a while in the marshmallow study is because the kids who could exert self-control, as you said, and wait, they were the ones who got higher GRE scores and SAT scores. They had better grades in school. So it seemed like some kids had self-control and others didn't. But what the situational approach tells us is you don't have to be special in any way. You just have to understand how to use your environment to help you meet your goals. And it takes the struggle out of it. It makes life more pleasant and more fun. And it means that more people can actually meet their goals.
Love that. Such a great approach for people to take and an encouraging one at that. Let's talk about some of the foundational principles of habits, and let's first talk about context. You've shown how altering the environment can successfully disrupt habits, like the tobacco use example that you put in your book. How do contexts act as force fields that either drive or restrain behaviors?
Some contexts make a behavior easier and others make it more difficult to repeat. One of the examples that I really like is a study that was done by a data analytics firm across several months, February, March. They tracked thousands of cell phones to see how far people traveled to go to a paid fitness center. So how far people are traveling to go to the gym. And what they found is that people who traveled a shorter distance, 3.5 miles, went to the gym 5 times a month on average. People who traveled a longer distance, over 5 miles, only went once a month. And so that small amount of friction is making it difficult for people to repeat a behavior. And it's making the difference between having a gym habit and not. And that is so different from the way we think about going to the gym, right? You think, you plan, you get yourself ready, you motivate yourself, you think about your long-term goals. Why am I doing this? It's good for me. Instead, small aspects of our environment, like how far you have to travel, are big determinants as well. And they are persistent determinants. So this is across several months that people are either going to the gym or not. And what the study suggests is that we really need to set up environments to make it easy to repeat the behaviors that are healthy, that are productive, that are going to make us happy, that are going to connect us with other people. And we also have to try to set up environments, our living environments, to make it harder to do the things that are not beneficial for us. And so it all has to do with how easy it is to repeat a behavior in a particular context. And traveling a long distance, waiting a long amount of time, or having to exert a lot of energy, all of those things are friction that reduce repetition, and so they reduce habit formation.
You say contexts include everything from physical surroundings to social environments, and they act as force fields, either driving behaviors through consistent cues or restraining them by creating friction, which is so important to really emphasize when you want to develop habits or when you want to break bad habits. And there's a lot of myths around habits. One popular myth says it takes 21 days to form a habit, but a lot of research has debunked that, but that's still a popular myth. Based on your research, and I know this doesn't fit for all habits, but how long does it really take to form a habit? And why does this myth persist?
I think it I think it persists because we're wishful thinking. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could say, I only do something 21 times and it'll be automatic and I won't have to think about it again. It seems like a manageable amount of time and effort for many people. It's a myth that we think came from a book, a popular book in the 1960s that was actually written by a plastic surgeon. And he was speculating how many days it would take for people to get used to a new image or some change after plastic surgery. So its origins don't seem to have anything to do with habit at all. So it's surprising that it's lived on as long as it has. But habits are a learning system, and it takes longer to learn some things than others. So it would be impossible to come up with one clear estimate that would work for most people and most behaviors. It depends on how stable the context is, how many times you repeat the behavior over and over in the same way, as well as how much you like the behavior, because that's another component of habit that we haven't talked about, is reward. Rewards are important in two ways for habits. One is that people are just more likely to repeat behaviors that are rewarding than ones that aren't. I mean, it's just human nature. We do things we like. We're not going to do things that we don't like. It's going to be harder. So if you're trying to form a new habit, it's a good idea to find something that is enjoyable to you or that you can make enjoyable in some way. And when I say enjoyable, I don't mean this is not like a reward in the way that we normally think of rewards, like your paycheck at the end of the month or losing weight after 6 months of being on a diet. Those are far too far in the future. The rewards that work for building habits are immediate rewards. And that's because when you do something that's rewarding, you make that cup of coffee in the morning and you actually make it and you get to enjoy it, your brain releases dopamine. And dopamine does a lot of different things. But one of the things it does is it ties together what's currently in memory. So it ties together the context you're in with the response you just gave that got that reward. It works in this way for less than a minute. So this has to be an immediate reward, something that you're experiencing while you're doing the behavior. And that's why the rewards for habits have to be concurrent with the action themselves, both because that's what's going to make us repeat the behavior into a habit, as well as it's going to generate that dopamine response that will enable the habit to form.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.